Now to talk through this morning's news in more detail is the journalist and broadcaster James Marlow. Welcome back to the show this morning, James. And we're going to start by talking about vaccinations. And there was some concern, wasn't there, that parents might be sidelined and that children as young as 12 would be able to decide whether or not they wanted to have this vaccine. But parents will be having consent.
Yes, we were just talking about that a moment ago. The headline over here in The Observer, which is on page 10, let parents decide on jab for 12 to 15-year-olds, urge vaccine advisors. As far as we know, they will be deciding, the parents, which is probably right. However, you think so?
Absolutely.
It's definitely right.
Yes.
However, I recall several years ago when we were in school, there wasn't too many questions asked with regard to our regular jabs. And that was with referring to smallpox and polio and yellow fever and TB and even recently the mumps and the measles and rubella. There was a campaign a few years ago where some communities across the country were a bit concerned about the possibility of some type of autism. But however, as I understand it, many NHS doctors got involved, their personal doctors, and explained the risks were so fine, you'll be better off taking these vaccines. And the reason I reference this story is because, and I know, I'm told on my Twitter account that I reference Israel and a few other countries around the Middle East quite a lot. However, I listen to the news there quite a lot, being a foreign journalist, foreign affairs journalist. And in Israel, they have been doing the 12+, the third vaccine for some time. And the reason is because that a few months ago, there was another outbreak of COVID across the country. It put a tremendous amount of pressure on the health service in Israel. A lot of people were very ill. And therefore, Israel has been vaccinating their 12 to 13, 14, 15 years, and there doesn't seem to be any problems whatsoever on this. So I think, and of course I'm not a doctor, just to stress that, but this is just another jab. We take medicine, we eat all sorts of junk food, we put all sorts of things inside our body. If the doctors say it's okay, then go with it.
My only reason I was disagreeing was on the issue of consent, because I think, for me, I balk at the idea of the state having control over what, is put into my children's arms. And I think we should, these are children. They're not even 16. We're talking about 12-year-olds. And if the JCVI and the CMOs are grappling with this issue about whether or not it's, what the benefits are, how's a 12-year-old supposed to know? It has to be in the hands of adults, and parents are the best to make that decision for their kids.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But I would say as well that the parents were probably also confused, because if there's a disagreement between the experts, then the parents are thinking, well, what should we do? We just don't know what to do. Therefore, see your local NHS doctor.
Now, in the last hour, we're talking about, of course, what's happening in Afghanistan, and you were talking about the Sunday Times story about how the Taliban have taken over the country, but essentially they've got no economic policies, no aid, no one to run the airport, no money to pay wages, and at the same time they're involved in a conflict with rebels.
Yeah.
As in, they were rebels, but now there are rebels against them.
That's right. The Taliban are the more extreme Islamists, not to be confused with ISIS, who is a little bit more extreme. And these are the more secular rebels who are holding out. And what is interesting is, in the Mail on Sunday on page 20, is that the Taliban are using, which we would expect, using the advanced weaponry left behind by the Americans to root out this resistance which the Taliban are now fighting against. There are various reports to say that the resistance has hit back quite hard and given the Taliban a real punch-in. Other reports say that the Taliban is very close. Now, of course, these are coming from the Taliban, and it's very difficult to really know what's taking place. But they have a head start as such. They've got a major advantage because they're using this advanced American weaponry, which Joe Biden, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States, decided to leave behind. Again, he claims that he was leaving it for the 300,000 Afghan army. We've already talked about this before. There was not 300,000, there was maybe 50 to 100,000. And the Americans already knew that they were fleeing beforehand because they saw their leaders fleeing beforehand. So perhaps the Americans, again, I've said this many times before, if they would have stayed on just a little bit longer, because it is a certain seasonal war which takes place in Afghanistan. In other words, the war stops at the end of September, beginning of October, for climate reasons. That would be a best time to pull out, take your armory out as well, and leave the Taliban and the rebels to fight against each other. And at the same time, maybe you could get a few more of those who worked for you, who did so much work for you. There's a basic human characteristic called gratitude. They put their lives at risk working for the embassy, translating, their families' lives at risk. Some of them, we've been told, have been killed. Some of them have been taken away. And the Americans owe a debt of gratitude. They need to get them out.
And it's interesting for a Taliban who claim that they're going to, respect people's rights. If there is a stronghold within the country that does not want to be taken over by the Taliban, they've resisted the Soviet invasion in the past, they've resisted, multiple invasions. It's a very independent valley, isn't it, this Panjshir region? And I gather thousands of Afghans are fleeing there, hoping to have some sanctuary from the Taliban. And yet, as you say, to see the hardware that the US have left behind, used against their own people, is not what some would say good optics.
And it's good to mention the 45 Black Hawk helicopters as well, which the Taliban can't actually fly, but they're learning to. And you see some videos sometimes where they're just beginning to get off the ground and come back down again, get off the ground, and it's a bit like a fun fair as such.
More importantly, though, to some people, unfortunately, is that apparently there's a shortage of coffee potentially on the way.
Yes, let's lighten the mood and just a little bit.
I can't cope with this shift without 3-4 coffees.
And that's the reason why I brought it up, simply because if you were to be asked the #1 country in the world for coffee, what would you reply?
Coffee drinkers?
Well, the country as such.
Oh, I don't know.
It's probably Brazil.
Right.
Although Brazil have a certain type of bean, and there are other countries that also have different types of beans. One of those countries is Vietnam. Vietnam has been hit very hard with the COVID pandemic. They've lost a lot of drivers, and they can't get the beans out to off the ground and into the jars and out. So therefore, Vietnam is suffering from a major coffee shortage. And as a result, experts believe that this could push up the price and could perhaps potentially create a shortage of coffee.
Do you know what? We've got our new lead for this morning.
I know there'll be people not very happy
Quick.
about that. James,
Exciting.
thank you very much indeed. James Marlow there, taking us through some of the inside of the Sunday papers. Now, let's move on to some economics news, because the Chancellor Rishi Sunak's furlough extension comes to an end later this month. The scheme was been aimed at supporting people during the pandemic by paying 80% of employees' wages for the hours that they cannot work during the pandemic, has been seen pretty much as a good success.
Well, there is concern over how many workers will return to the office, as some employers may decide